Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a battle or a banquet, but with the very personal, very pungent world of medieval hygiene. We're stepping into a time when people feared bathing more than plague, when garlic could double as perfume, and when your neighbor might literally throw strange things out the window and call it normal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Cleanliness is next to godliness, said absolutely no one in the 14th century. Let's begin with a surprising fact. In the early Middle Ages, bathing was actually considered a good thing. Monasteries had bathhouses. Roman traditions of soaking and scrubbing still lingered in some corners of Europe. But over time, particularly by the late medieval period, the idea of bathing shifted from healthy to hazardous. So what changed? In short, fear, superstition, and a wildly incorrect understanding of how the human body worked. People believed that hot water opened the pores, which they thought allowed illness to seep in. Imagine bathing during a plague outbreak and thinking, I've just turned myself into a sponge for death. That was the mindset. Bathing too often, they feared, could weaken your body and even invite disease. Water in this worldview wasn't cleansing. It was treacherous. It didn't help that bathhouse became morally suspicious. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many public bathhouses, once places of hygiene and even community, became social hubs with a rather scandalous reputation. Some operated like spas, others like brothel. Eventually, church leaders began to associate bathing with sin, which in medieval Europe was an excellent way to get things shut down. So, instead of scrubbing down, many medieval folks just stopped bathing altogether. Not because they loved being dirty, but because staying dry was seen as safer, holier, and frankly more modest. After all, being naked was one thing. Being naked in hot water. That was practically inviting the devil in for a splash. This doesn't mean everyone wandered around like a mud-covered goblin. People still cleaned themselves in bits and pieces, washing hands, faces, and feet with cloths and herbal rinses. But the full-body soak became rare. Reserved for the very wealthy, the dangerously brave, or the terminally itchy. So yes, medieval people feared bathing, but not because they were lazy or ignorant. They were trying in their own 14th century way to stay healthy. Unfortunately, without germ theory, indoor plumbing, or a basic grasp of microbiology, the strategy was more paranoia than prevention. Once upon a time in a town that didn't yet smell like horse manure and regret, the public bathhouse was a hub of hygiene, health, and mildly inappropriate social interaction. Inspired by lingering Roman influence, early medieval bathhouse offered warm water, communal tubs, and a hint of optimism. These were places where townsfolk could soak, steam, and chat, like a medieval spa day, minus the cucumbers and scented candles. Monks, merchants, and even lower nobles used them. Cleanliness for a brief moment in time was both possible and fashionable. Then things got steamy in the worst way. By the 13th century, bathhouse had acquired a reputation for, let's say, multitasking. Bathing became less about cleanliness and more about companionship. Some bathhouse began offering extra services with attendants who were suspiciously friendly and water that had seen far too many strangers. The line between wellness and wantedness blurred fast. It didn't take long for the church to get involved. Public nudity, even when paired with a loofah, was frowned upon. Sexual misconduct even worse. Bathhouse became synonymous with sin, disease, and scandal. And once the Black Death rolled into town, people were more than happy to shut them down permanently. After all, you can't spread plague through a public tub if the tub's been boarded shut and declared morally compromised. But it wasn't just sin and sickness that doomed the bathhouse. It was suspicion. Over time, bathing itself began to seem indulgent, even dangerous. The very idea of soaking your body in warm water, especially with strangers, felt like a gateway to both physical and spiritual ruin. And so, one by one, the bathhouse closed. Some were turned into bakeries. Others were simply abandoned and left to rot. A poetic fate really, for buildings meant to keep people clean. Meanwhile, in monasteries, monks quietly lamented the loss. Many had maintained hygienic practices for centuries, including scheduled bathing, but now even that was in question. The church wasn't banning hygiene outright, just making it incredibly difficult to achieve. Thus began the golden age of dry cleaning, medieval style. Soap became optional, water became suspicious, and the bathhouse, just another relic of a time when scrubbing didn't come with consequences. Despite the church's growing horror at naked elbows and the widespread belief that a hot bath could let the plague in through your paws, medieval people didn't completely abandon the idea of bathing. They just turned it into something you'd do once a season or when the smell became sentient. Alright, let's start with the nobles. Yes, the wealthy did bathe, though not so often that their rubber ducks got all wrinkly. Since indoor plumbing was centuries away, they had servants haul in giant cauldrons of boiling water. This was poured into a large wooden tub lined with a linen sheet and sprinkled with herbs like lavender, sage, or whatever grew nearby that didn't smell like old socks. This wasn't so much a bath as it was a warm, herbal soup you sat in. The bath was usually set up in the bedroom or by the fireplace. Privacy? Well, that depended on your status or how shameless you felt. Some couples even shared the tub, because, honestly, what's more romantic than floating together in each other's filth like a medieval fondue? The poor bathed too, but their options were rivers, barrels, or any container that could hold water and didn't bite back. Bathing wasn't really about hygiene for them, it was about efficiency. Probably more than once, someone said, might as well wash the kid, the shirt, and the goat all at once. Come winter, bathing dropped way down the list, survival took priority. Instead of soap and water, the go-to strategy was basically, pretend you're clean and keep moving. A few urban bathhouses survived, mostly in southern Europe, where the warmer weather and slightly better plumbing kept the dream of cleanliness alive. Some were well run, with steam rooms and herbal treatments. Others? Let's just say they doubled as venues for extracurricular activities the Vatican definitely wouldn't approve of. Either way, you left feeling refreshed, mildly steamed, and maybe just a little judged. For special occasions like childbirth or recovering from plague, folks got real baths, because nothing says, welcome to the world, or, please don't die, like being dipped in a barrel of tepid rosemary water. When full-body immersion became suspect, thanks to the belief that hot water invited disease like an open bar, the medieval world turned to the humble sponge bath. Except they didn't have soft, store-bought sponges. Instead, linen cloths soaked in warm water, herbs, or vinegar did the job, wiped gently like you were trying not to ruin a delicate antique chair. Hygiene in this era basically meant dabbing. If you were lucky, someone else did the dabbing for you. If you were noble, they did it, though maybe a bit reluctantly. These quick cleans focused on the high-traffic areas, hands, face, armpits, and sometimes feet. Underneath layers of clothing, linen shirts and shifts, people trapped sweat and grime, so changing that shirt regularly was about as close to modern hygiene as it got. Your tunic might have been crusty, but at least your undershirt was fresh. Nobody fooled themselves into thinking this was proper cleaning, but when water was limited or a proper bath might bring the Black Death knocking, dabbing was the safest bet. And remember, in a world without deodorant, toothpaste, or showers, wiping down with rose water or vinegar was basically a medieval spa day, minus the spa, and definitely minus the day. For wealthier folks, attendants heated the water, mixed in herbs like rosemary or marjoram, and gently washed their master or mistress, while pretending not to judge too much. Peasants boiled water over fires and ladled it into bowls to do the same, maybe without the subtle judgment, but certainly with more drafts. Monks probably had the best routines. Many orders required scheduled washing, not always for sanitation, but for spiritual reasons. Either way, the result was a quick rub, a whisper of moisture, and feeling just clean enough not to scare off the livestock. So, no, it wasn't glamorous, but it mostly worked, at least until you had to ride a horse for 6 hours through mud. If medieval hair had a motto, it'd probably be, flammable but fragrant. Contrary to popular belief, people didn't just wander around with matted bird nests on their heads, at least, not on purpose. They did wash their hair, just not often, and definitely not with anything like shampoo. What did they use? A bizarre mix of homebrewed concoctions that sounded more like spells than hygiene. One popular recipe was lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat, great for cutting grease but also guaranteed to irritate your scalp if you used it too much. Add water of questionable cleanliness, and you had yourself a medieval chemical peel. Some tried to be gentler with egg yolks, which meant sitting in a freezing hut with raw eggs sliding down your neck, convincing yourself this was nourishing. Others rinsed with beer. Sure, it left you smelling like you'd had a wild night, but at least it helped get rid of lice. Vinegar infusions with rosemary or lavender were popular rinses, too. They masked other smells and gave the illusion of care. But let's be honest, nobody was lathering up and rinsing twice. This was more of a targeted splash and squeeze operation. Water temperature mattered a lot. Hot water supposedly weakened your brain. Cold water could give you the plague. Lukewarm was the sweet spot, if you had the fuel to heat it and didn't mind waiting 3 hours for a bucket of bath water your sibling hadn't already used. Brushing hair, though, was routine. Combs made from bone, wood, or horn were common, and often intricately carved. A rare touch of elegance in an otherwise itchy reality. People took pride in long, well-kept hair. Noblewomen might spend hours braiding, coiling, and veiling their hair, always hoping a nearby fireplace wouldn't undo their hard work with one rogue spark. As for teeth, medieval dental care was less sparkling smile and more, I still have most of my teeth, what's your excuse? To their credit, medieval people didn't totally ignore oral hygiene. They didn't quite get it, but they made a solid effort with whatever they had, mostly cloth, charcoal, and a whole lot of blind hope. There were no toothbrushes back then. That handy invention was still centuries away. Instead, folks used linen rags to scrub their teeth clean, ideally soaked in something abrasive like salt, crushed mint, or even burnt rosemary ash. The goal wasn't sparkling white teeth, it was survival. If your breath didn't knock someone over, you were already winning. Some preferred chewing sticks, thin twigs from trees like hazel or elm, frayed at one end to act like a brush. You chewed until the fibers separated, then scrubbed your teeth. Think of it as the original biodegradable toothbrush, organic, compostable, and weirdly bark-flavored. To freshen breath, people chewed fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom, depending on what they could afford or sneak from the spice rack. In wealthier circles, rinsing the mouth with vinegar, wine, or even myrrh water was common, because nothing says dental sophistication like gargling a fluid used to embalm pharaohs. And toothpaste? Sort of. Recipes included powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and oyster shell ash mixed with honey or oil to form a gritty paste. If your mouth didn't feel cleaner afterward, at least it felt sandblasted. Dentists, if you could call them that, were usually barbers on their days off. Got a loose, infected, or annoying tooth? The solution was simple: yank it out. No anesthetic, no fuss. Just a wooden chair, a strong grip, and a quick prayer. Afterwards, you rinsed with wine and hoped your soul left your body before infection set in. Despite all this, medieval people weren't necessarily toothless. Their diets had less processed sugar, and many rural folks had better dental health than today's snack lovers. But when rot did set in, it moved fast. And the only toothpaste strong enough to fix it was divine intervention. Now, imagine you time traveled to a bustling medieval town square. Your first reaction? Not awe. Gagging. Because medieval Europe smelled committed, committed to being unforgettable. No sewage systems, no deodorant, and barely any working bathtubs meant the average street smelled like a sweaty mix of animals, rotting food, and misplaced optimism. If your nose survived the fish market and the tanner's shop, congratulations, you'd already outperformed most tourists. So how did people cope with this olfactory assault? They got creative. Enter the pomander, a small hollow ball filled with herbs and spices, worn around the neck or tucked into clothing like a medieval Glade plug-in. Stuffed with cloves, cinnamon, lavender, or musk, and sometimes dipped in ambergris or whale oil, it was supposed to smell pleasant. Think of it as a portable air filter, though it didn't purify anything, just politely overpowered the stench. Ladies often carried scented sachets in their bodices to mask their own body odor and to ward off others. Some even braided herbs like rosemary or marjoram directly into their hair. Equal parts hygiene, fashion, and spiritual pest control. For those with coin, perfume was imported from the Middle East or Italy, made from rose oil or civet, the latter extracted from the rear end of a very surprised cat-like animal. Applying it involved dabbing, waving, and pretending you weren't just covering up the stench of boiled turnips and regret. Then there were the environmental smells, open sewers, livestock, candle smoke, and whatever the butcher just tossed into the street. Cities often lay shrouded in a fog of funk. But no one really complained, everyone was in the same nasal nightmare together. Communal suffering with a hint of garlic. The church pushed spiritual cleanliness, but physical scent was mostly left to chance. If you smelled decent, people assumed you were rich or saintly. If not, you just blended in. If you've ever forgotten deodorant and spent the day nervously checking your pits like a suspicious criminal, imagine doing that your whole life, except deodorant didn't exist, and everyone smelled like they'd been jousting in wool for 3 days straight. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where body odor wasn't a possibility, it was an identity. No roll-ons, no sprays, no clinical-strength aluminum antiperspirants. People just sweated and made peace with it, sort of. To mask or manage the musk, various tricks were used. One common method was alum powder, a naturally occurring mineral salt with mild antibacterial and astringent properties. It didn't stop sweat but cut down the stench, if you remembered to apply it and didn't mind grinding rocks into your pits. Others used chalk, vinegar rinses, or crushed herbs. Sage, mint, and rosemary were popular, not because they worked well, but because they smelled better than you did. The logic was simple, if you can't stop the sweat, at least try to smell like a salad. Perfumed handkerchiefs were all the rage among nobles, mainly so they could hold them under their noses while navigating crowded streets. No one wanted to smell like medieval stew meat, but everyone did. The best you could do was smell like floral stew meat. Medieval medicine also weighed in. Physicians believed sweating was a healthy way to purge bad humors, so blocking it was seen as suspicious, even dangerous. You were expected to sweat, stink, and let your body cleanse itself. You weren't unclean, you were medically fragrant. Then there was the fashion problem. Layers upon layers of wool, linen, and fur trapped heat and moisture like a mobile greenhouse. Add open fires, feasting, and the occasional plague, and you had a sensory experience worthy of a full-blown evacuation. But hey, you weren't alone. Everyone around you smelled too, even the king, the priests, and the woman selling radishes who hadn't bathed since Epiphany. In short, deodorant didn't exist. But shared suffering? That was real. In a world without showers, soaps that didn't maim, or deodorants that didn't involve stuffing herbs into your armpits, medieval people had an unlikely hygiene hero, linen. Not to eat off of, but to wear, preferably close to the body and changed before it grew legs. Linen undergarments were the unsung saviors of the Middle Ages. Breathable, absorbent, and surprisingly durable, they were worn beneath the heavier, less washable layers of wool and fur. Linen shirts, shifts, and chemises soaked up the sweat, grime, and everything else the body enthusiastically produced in a world that celebrated moisture but misunderstood soap. The logic was elegant, wash the linen, not the person. Scrubbing your own body was risky, see, the plague. But scrubbing your shirt? Perfectly safe. People might go weeks without bathing, but they would change their linen underlayer, sometimes twice a week, which by medieval standards was practically saintly. Linen was so respected it became a status signal. If your shirt was white and relatively clean, people assumed you had your life together. If it was gray, crusty, and sprouting mold, well, you were either poor, possessed, or recently resurrected. For women, the linen shift was essential. It protected outer garments from sweat and, more importantly, from the smell of sweat. Think of it as the medieval version of Febreze, only less chemical and far more judgmental if not properly maintained. Knights wore linen under their armor to avoid turning into baked ham during tournaments. Monks wore it under their habits. Even peasants wore linen tunics, usually patched, threadbare, and held together by sheer willpower. Of course, washing linen wasn't fun. It involved boiling water, beating the fabric on rocks, and praying the river didn't sweep it away. But it was still easier than bathing yourself or risking the spiritual consequences of baring your chest to a tub of warm water. If there was one thing truly consistent in the medieval hygiene routine, it was itching. Not just because of allergies to linen or hay, though, let's be honest, probably that too, but because everyone hosted a traveling circus of lice, fleas, and mites. Lice were such a daily nuisance they were treated like unwanted roommates. You didn't get lice, you had lice. Rich, poor, pious, drunk, lice didn't discriminate. They were the true equalizers of medieval society. So, what did people do? For starters, they combed. Lice combs, often made of bone or wood, were common personal items, like toothbrushes today. Except instead of polishing teeth, you were raking bugs off your scalp like some tiny screaming orchard. These combs had fine, closely packed teeth designed to pull out critters, their eggs, and most of your patience. Another method was boiling clothes or baking them near the fire. The heat could kill the lice, assuming you didn't burn your only tunic in the process. That's why you might see medieval illustrations of people holding up shirts near flames. Not laundry day, it was pest execution. Then there was the classic bald solution. Particularly among monks or those who could get away with a bald look, shaving your head was an effective, if dramatic, way to evict the vermin. Sometimes a wig was worn on top. Ironically, it could become its own lice hotel if not cleaned properly. The logic was clear: no hair, no home for the bugs. Fleas were another problem, especially for those sleeping in straw mattresses or near animals. There were no flea collars or sprays, only smoke fumigation and herbal sachets tossed between the sheets. Some believed certain smells repelled pests, others just hoped fleas moved on to someone smellier. The real solution? Endurance. Everyone itched. Everyone scratched. It was part of life, like taxes, death, or stepping in something unspeakable near the market stalls. Ah, the medieval toilet, a term wildly optimistic. Going to the bathroom was less about comfort and more about creative improvisation with very low expectations. For the elite, castles had garderobes, closets with a hole and a stone bench that dropped waist straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes a pit, and occasionally into an unlucky patch of earth someone forgot to fence off. Often placed high in towers for privacy and added thrill of gravity, you learned quickly not to loiter beneath one. Peasants had fewer luxuries. Most did their business outside, in the woods, near rivers, or behind barns. Some villages had communal pits, outhouses with very low standards and even lower privacy. Your neighbor might be in there discussing crop yields mid-squat. At night, chamber pots were the star of the show, portable pots tucked under beds or beside sleeping areas, ready to receive contributions in the dark. If you've never relieved yourself into a cold ceramic bowl next to your sleeping family, congratulations, you're not medieval. What happened to the contents of these pots? They were thrown out the window with a hearty shout, guard low. Watch out for the water. Residents dumped waste into the street below, ideally not hitting passers-by, but accuracy wasn't guaranteed. Street sanitation. Mostly handled by gravity and pigs. Cities sometimes had gutters or central ditches to carry waste away, though these often clogged, overflowed, or just fermented into a neighborhood feature. Toilet paper. Not quite. People used rags, moss, straw, their hands, or, for the very refined, bits of wool or linen scraps. If that sounds unpleasant, imagine using snow in winter. They did. Before medieval bathing became suspicious or sinful, public bathhouses actually thrived across Europe. These weren't just tubs and soap, they were the social hotspots of their day. Think of medieval bathhouses as spas with a few extra plot twists. They offered hot baths, steam rooms, massages, food, music, and depending on the place, the occasional questionable companionship. At their best, they were communal wellness centers. At their worst, bare-skinned dens of gossip, gluttony, and light scandal, sometimes all three before noon. They were called stews, not because you sat in one too long, though you might, but because of the steamy water. Mixed-gender bathing wasn't unheard of, especially in places like Germany or Italy, where attitudes were a bit more relaxed. It wasn't always risque. Families could attend together. Monks sometimes bathed in pairs. But human nature being what it is, boundaries got murky. So did the water. Unsurprisingly, bathhouses became a favorite target for the church. Clerics warned that bathing in mixed company led to sin, which, to be fair, it often did. Some bathhouses subtly became brothels with plumbing. The waters got hot, and not just from the fire beneath the tubs. Then came the plagues, and everything changed. When diseases like the Black Death struck, bathhouses were blamed. Doctors believed open pores invited disease, and since warm baths opened pores, well, the math added up in a "we don't know about germs" sort of way. Bathhouses shut down, reputations tanked, and suddenly, public baths were out permanently. Some regions held on longer. Southern Europe, the Middle East, and certain port cities kept their stews boiling for decades more. But in Northern and Central Europe, bathhouses vanished faster than your dignity after slipping into a communal tub. What remained was a mix of nostalgia and paranoia. Bathhouses had once been warm, lively places, but also symbols of sin, disease, and damp decisions. By the 1500s, the average person wasn't soaking with strangers anymore. They were dabbing their armpits with vinegar and praying for soap that didn't smell like goat. Soap in the Middle Ages was a lot like medicine, harsh, experimental, and likely to make you question your life choices. It technically worked, but using it felt more like punishment than self-care. The most common recipe was a hearty blend of animal fat and lye, or, if you want to sound fancy, rendered tallow and wood ash. Combined, these ingredients created a substance that could strip dirt, oil, and possibly your soul from any surface. Early soap didn't come in pastel bars with ocean breeze scents. It came in coarse, waxy lumps that looked like something you'd avoid stepping in. Making it required patience and a strong stomach. Boil down sheep or pig fat, stir in alkaline ash water, and wait for it to harden into blocks. If you added herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, you could pretend it was artisanal. Mostly, it just smelled like damp campfire and disappointment. Soap was mainly for laundry and heavy-duty scrubbing, not casual body washing. Skin was considered delicate, and lye soap could turn a bath into a mild chemical burn. Still, people used it when necessary, before weddings, court appearances, or plague outbreaks. More refined soaps came from the Islamic world and southern Europe, especially Castile soap from Spain. Made with olive oil instead of animal fat, it was far gentler on skin. These soaps were coveted luxury goods traded across the Mediterranean and reserved for people who didn't already smell like goat every day. For most folks, soap was a utility, not a pleasure. You used it to wash linens, dishes, maybe your hands if they were really offensive. It wasn't part of daily hygiene but more a monthly event, like taxes or a full moon. Some people went their whole lives with minimal soap and considered themselves just fine, especially when surrounded by others doing the same. Communal odor has a way of setting the bar low. Doing laundry wasn't just a chore, it was a full-body workout, a community event, and a flirtation with frostbite. Forget laundromats or washing machines. Clean clothes meant boiling, beating, and begging the weather to cooperate. Most laundry happened in rivers, picturesque until you remember these rivers also served as sewers, livestock baths, and occasional body disposal sites. But hey, running water is running water. First, you soaked linens in lye or urine. Yes, actual human urine collected in pots until it reached peak potency, known as chamber lye. Valued for its ammonia, it helped lift stains and whiten fabric. The smell? Less helpful. But in a time when perfume was optional and hygiene was interpretive, it did the trick. After soaking, clothes were dragged to the river, scrubbed against wooden boards or flat stones, and pounded with paddles in a process called fulling. It wasn't a gentle wash, it was a clothes interrogation. This could take hours and often involved washerwomen feared and admired for their arm strength. Then came rinsing, wringing, and drying, which, if it rained, meant waiting another day and hoping your shirt didn't develop sentience. Clothes were often spread across bushes, hedges, or stretched on lines between trees and huts. Medieval villages looked like never-ending yard sales. Of course, not everyone did their own laundry. Wealthy households had servants, monasteries had lay brothers, and some towns even boasted professional washers. But for most people, it was DIY or nothing. Interestingly, clean clothes mattered more than clean bodies. You might not have bathed in a month, but if your linen shift was bright and fresh, relatively speaking, you were considered presentable. In some cases, laundry was hygiene. After 14 chapters of scratching, scrubbing, sniffing, and surviving, the big question remains, did medieval hygiene actually work, or was everyone just one unwashed tunic away from spontaneous combustion? The short answer, it worked well enough. Not by modern standards, of course. If you time travel back to 1347, your nostrils might file for divorce. But in their own context, medieval folks weren't oblivious to cleanliness. They just operated on a different scale of what counted as clean. They had systems, even if those systems involved vinegar foot soaks and chamber pots hurled out windows. They had tools, lice combs, layered linens, vinegar, herbs, ash-based soap. They had rituals, too. Whether it was sponge bathing before Sunday Mass or boiling one's underwear on a full moon, hygiene existed. It was just deeply tangled with fear, faith, and the weather. In many ways, medieval people did the best they could with what they had, while trying not to anger God, the local baron, or their own armpits. Regular full-body bathing was risky, time-consuming, and, thanks to church doctrine and plague fears, considered medically unwise. So they got inventive. Surprisingly, some practices aged well. Linen undergarments were hygienically smart. Herb-infused water and vinegar rinses had solid antibacterial logic. Even communal bathhouses were effective, until they turned into hot tubs of gossip and syphilis. Yes, people smelled, scratched, shared baths, lice, and some truly misguided medical advice. Yet many lived to old age, or at least to a second harvest, despite the hygiene horrors. Their standards were fluid, but they weren't without effort. Hygiene was more social signal than science. Clean clothes equaled virtue, shiny, or at least less itchy, hair meant discipline, avoiding full-body rot was just good manners. In the end, medieval hygiene worked much like balancing a wagon wheel with twine, barely, but impressively, given the tools. Underscore 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 underscore. Now, imagine walking through Mohenjo-daro, a city over 4,000 years old, an ancient jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. If you picture dusty huts and random alleys, think again. This place was so well planned it could make a modern city planner weep with envy. Constructed around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-daro wasn't thrown together like a festival campsite. It was meticulously organized. The city followed a grid pattern, actual blocks and right angles. Streets ran north-south and east-west, intersecting cleanly like someone had a ruler and said, "Let's keep this geometric." But the real magic wasn't just on the surface. Beneath those dusty roads was a system even 21st-century cities often fail to maintain: drainage. Nearly every house, no matter how small, had water access and drainage. Wastewater flowed from homes into covered drains running alongside streets. You could almost hear ancient residents saying, "Yes, sanitation matters." The city wasn't just a giant bathroom with bricks. It was zoned intentionally, a citadel on a raised mound likely housed administrative or religious elites, while a lower city housed the general population. Public buildings like the famous Great Bath show this wasn't just survival, it was ritual and maybe even recreation soaked into clay bricks. Markets likely thrived along main streets, and house sizes varied, showing social stratification. Even modest homes had private wells and toilets. Let that sink in. People with fewer means had indoor plumbing 4 millennia ago, while many 19th-century Europeans were still tossing waste out windows. And then mystery. The city was abandoned, not by conquest or fire, but silence. Perhaps climate shifts, perhaps trade disruption. Whatever the cause, Mohenjo-daro's legacy endures, a city built with intent, intelligence, and a clear understanding that clean water and zoning laws matter. And they didn't even have an urban planning department. Go figure. Underscore 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 underscore. If Mohenjo-daro was the tidy accountant of ancient cities, Babylon was the theatrical celebrity. Flashy, vast, drenched in myth, Babylon was more than a city, it was a symbol. Rising and falling over centuries, its prime came around the 6th century BCE under Nebuchadnezzar II. Don't let the poetry fool you. Babylon was as carefully planned as it was majestic. Walled and massive, its most famous landmark, the Ishtar Gate, was adorned with dazzling blue tiles and sacred lions fit for a dream sequence. But it wasn't just decoration. The gate was part of a carefully orchestrated urban layout. At the city's core ran a sacred axis, a processional way, a parade route for gods, literally. Religious festivals like the Akita New Year processed along this street, linking the Great Ziggurat, which may have inspired the Tower of Babel story, to the mighty Temple of Marduk. Babylon's urban planning was part piety, part propaganda. You didn't just live in Babylon, you walked its holy narrative every day. Streets curved with the river and the land's contours but were zoned smartly: residential quarters, temple complexes, gardens, markets, administrative centers. The Euphrates River sliced through Babylon like a shimmering artery, providing not only water but a navigable highway for trade, commerce, and, let's be honest, some serious showing off. Babylonian engineers weren't messing around. Drainage systems were in place, though not quite as polished as those in the Indus Valley. Still, homes had bathrooms fitted with clay pipes and canals to whisk wastewater away. Even the bricks bore inscriptions of the king's name, because if you're going to build sewers, you might as well brand them. Babylon was a city designed to impress both mortals and gods. Every street, gate, and temple was a statement: look upon my works, ye mighty, and marvel at the zoning permits. And people did. Even Alexander the Great reportedly planned to make Babylon his capital, because after strolling down a street made for a god, Athens probably felt a bit, well, underwhelming. Underscore 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 underscore. Roughly 1,000 years before the Aztecs marveled at its ruins and named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born, this ancient Mexican city was already flexing its urban design muscles. At its peak around 500 CE, Teotihuacan was one of the world's largest cities, home to over 100,000 people. And unlike the chaotic sprawl of some modern megacities, this place was deliberately mapped out with the precision of a sacred geometry student who never forgot their protractor. The city's most iconic feature was the Avenue of the Dead. Despite its morbid name, thanks, Aztecs, it was less a cemetery and more a ceremonial boulevard stretching over 2 miles. This grand avenue wasn't an accident. It was a central axis aligned with astronomical events, flanked by temples, plazas, elite residences, and bustling markets. Connecting the Pyramid of the Moon in the north with the massive Pyramid of the Sun, this sacred spine structured the entire city. Here's where it gets even more advanced. Teotihuacan's layout was orthogonal, meaning it followed a grid system tilted about 15.5 degrees off true north, possibly to align with celestial phenomena or sacred mountains. This wasn't random. It was cosmological urban planning with a cosmic compass and zoning laws to match. Residential compounds were arranged in modular blocks, often housing multiple families with shared patios and drainage systems. Some compounds were lavishly decorated, signaling wealth, while others reflected a more communal, working-class lifestyle. This wasn't just a city. It was an organized society made visible in stone and stucco. Teotihuacan also boasted a sophisticated water management system. Canals and drains ran alongside streets and through residential zones to prevent flooding during rainy seasons. You get the sense these engineers would have been deeply offended by potholes. While much about the city's rulers and power structure remains mysterious, one thing is clear: Teotihuacan was built to impress both the eyes and the skies. It was a blueprint of order, combining ritual with rationality. When the Aztecs stumbled upon its towering ruins centuries later, they didn't just admire it, they assumed gods must have built it. Honestly, after seeing such symmetry, who could blame them? Underscore 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 underscore. When we talk about ancient urban planning, it's tempting to picture a lone mastermind, the ancient equivalent of a city architect with a scroll and a grand vision. But in the Indus Valley civilization, planning wasn't a ruler's whim. It was a cultural consensus so strong that cities like Harappa and Lothal shared shockingly similar features. These weren't just sister cities, they were practically architectural clones. And that says something profound. Take Harappa, in modern-day Pakistan. Like Mohenjo-daro, it had a grid layout with uniform bricks, clear zoning for industrial, residential, and administrative uses, and yes, advanced drainage systems. Each home connected to street drains via private chutes or underground terra-cotta pipes. This wasn't just sanitation, it was dignity by design, ensuring even common citizens had clean facilities. Lothal, near the Arabian Sea, added yet another layer of sophistication: port planning. It had what might be the earliest known dockyard in the world, complete with a massive basin and sluice gates to control water levels. This wasn't a random riverside outpost, it was a shipping hub with infrastructure that anticipated tides and water flow. Venice, eat your heart out. What makes this even more remarkable is what's missing. No evidence of kings, palaces, military fortresses, statues of elites, or inscriptions boasting victories. Instead, these cities seem to have been run by efficient bureaucracies or councils focused on hygiene, trade, and ritual. Their power came from engineering, not empire. Artifacts like standardized weights and measures hint at a tightly regulated economy, with designated market areas and craft zones. You can almost imagine ancient planning committees debating warehouse placement or sewer width. Because these decisions weren't one-offs, they were uniform, stretching across hundreds of miles. They weren't building just for the elite. The uniformity in home construction, water access, and public amenities like baths and wells points to an urban ideal that was collective, not hierarchical. The real architects of these cities weren't merely shaping towns, they were shaping societies where order was embedded in every brick, where planning wasn't a privilege but a principle. When we think of zoning today, we imagine bureaucrats arguing over parking lots. But 4 millennia ago, it was about dignity, hygiene, and harmony. Permits and whether someone's Airbnb violates residential codes. But zoning, the practice of dividing a city into designated areas for living, working, worshipping, and yes, even dumping your garbage, isn't modern. It's ancient and surprisingly widespread. Cities like Mohenjo-daro, Babylon, and Teotihuacan weren't just random clusters of buildings. They were carefully orchestrated spaces, each with a clear logic behind their layout. Let's start with Mohenjo-daro again. There, the raised citadel housed public baths, granaries, and possibly administrative buildings. Below it sprawled residential quarters, separated by broad avenues. Workshops and kilns were pushed to the edges, probably because nobody wanted their home filled with smoke and the clanging of pottery wheels. It's zoning by pure common sense. But the impressive part? This model repeated across Indus cities, creating a cohesive urban identity. Now jump over to Babylon. Babylonian zoning wasn't just about function, it was also about ritual and propaganda. Temples and palaces dominated the city's heart, connected by ceremonial routes. Administrative buildings and elite homes clustered nearby, while commoners and markets were pushed outward. But everyone, rich or poor, lived under the same overarching city philosophy, organized, purposeful, and strikingly sophisticated. Then there's Teotihuacan, where zoning reached near surgical precision. The city's strict grid layout divided it into clear sectors, residential compounds, craft production zones, market areas, and temple complexes, all coordinated like parts of a living body. Some compounds even housed immigrants, whole neighborhoods from places like the Gulf Coast, each built in the architectural style of their homeland. It was zoning plus multiculturalism, circa 500 CE. This level of spatial organization reveals one crucial truth: these weren't just cities. They were intentional societies. Urban space reflected values, spiritual, political, and economic. Where you lived, worked, and worshipped was all pre-mapped by people who understood not only how humans move but how they relate. And no, they didn't need modern GIS software, just sharp observation, engineering know-how, and maybe a divine mandate or two. Because when a society can enforce zoning laws without Twitter outrage or lawsuits, you know their urban planning game was ahead of its time. Underscore 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 underscore. We often imagine the ancient world as gloriously filthy, muddy streets, chamber pots, and the unmistakable perfume of unwashed crowds. But the truth is, some ancient cities cared a lot about sanitation. In fact, several had public hygiene systems that would make a 19th-century European blush. Let's return to Mohenjo-daro, our sanitation superstar. Nearly every house, no matter its size, had a private bathing area with a sloped floor to drain water. Wastewater was funneled into covered street drains, yes, covered drains lined with bricks and equipped with access holes for cleaning. These drains ran along nearly every street, whisking waste away from the city. It was essentially an early version of municipal plumbing. This wasn't just clever, it was revolutionary. Compare that to Babylon, where hygiene was more symbolic than systematic. The city had canals and some drainage channels, and clay pipes carried water into palaces and temples. But for the average citizen, sanitation often meant cesspits, open ditches, and a lot of divine forgiveness. Still, bathrooms were common, and wealthier homes enjoyed indoor plumbing using clay pipes. Some records even hint at rudimentary flushing systems, likely involving buckets and some good timing. Now, zoom into Teotihuacan. Though not quite as obsessed with drainage as the Indus Valley, it still featured carefully engineered stormwater canals and separate sewage systems in elite compounds. Many residential complexes had internal drains, and public buildings often had designated latrines. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort, it was probably tied to religious purity, especially in ritual areas like temples or the Avenue of the Dead. Even smaller ancient cities like Lothal and Harappa show a deep understanding of hydrology, with wells, reservoirs, and streets designed with slopes to prevent flooding. Imagine planning entire towns with gravity and seasonal monsoons in mind, and pulling it off in 2400 BCE. What makes all this so impressive isn't just the tech. It's the mindset. These civilizations viewed water not just as a necessity but as something to be channeled, shared, and respected. Hygiene wasn't a luxury for elites, it was embedded in urban design itself. Modern cities still wrestle with waste management. These ancients? They were already digging trenches and laying bricks, quietly reminding us that flushing is a civilizational achievement. Underscore 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 underscore. If temples were where ancient people spoke to gods, markets were where they negotiated with each other, and probably argued over the price of onions. Every ancient city we've explored had a beating economic heart, pulsing in the form of carefully planned marketplaces, trade routes, and economic zoning. In Babylon, markets weren't chaotic afterthoughts squeezed between temples. They were institutionalized, woven into the urban grid, and regulated by law. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest legal texts, devotes dozens of clauses to trade practices, weights, measures, and merchant behavior. Markets bustled under porticos and open-air squares. Grains, textiles, wine, slaves, and livestock changed hands while scribes tracked debts and transactions. This wasn't just shopping. It was commerce with a legal backbone. Shift to Teotihuacan, where things get even more fascinating. The city hosted enormous market plazas, especially near the Ciudadela complex, where thousands gathered to trade obsidian tools, cacao, feathers, ceramics, and salt. Unlike highly centralized temple economies, Teotihuacan's market system appeared decentralized and community-driven, with different neighborhoods specializing in specific crafts. Think of it as an ancient version of local Etsy shops, except your currency was cacao beans, and your storefront was a stone platform. Supplier lived in the next compound. Meanwhile, in Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus cities with their wide avenues and adjacent warehouses, archaeologists have uncovered standardized weights and scales, clear signs of a robust system of regulation. Goods from as far away as Mesopotamia, including seals and precious stones, have been found at Indus sites, showing that international trade was very much a thing. Imagine your neighborhood fishmonger accepting Mesopotamian currency and not even blinking. But it wasn't just about money. Markets were social hubs. In Babylon, they were places to catch gossip, settle disputes, and see who was wearing the latest Assyrian tunic. In Teotihuacan, they were multicultural melting pots, where traders and travelers from distant lands mingled beneath the shadows of pyramids. Even the Indus cities, lacking grand palaces or towering temples, prioritized economic zones in their urban design. Trade drove innovation. It demanded roads, regulation, and records. And ancient urban planners responded not with chaos, but with structure. Behind every sacred temple or fortress wall, there was a merchant yelling, "Best price in the city." Underscore 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 underscore. In the ancient world, urban planning wasn't just about sewage systems and shopping districts, it was about the gods. Temples weren't tucked away in quiet corners, they dominated skylines, perched atop the city's highest points, demanding prime real estate. If markets were the city's heartbeat, temples were its soul, and ancient planners made sure everyone knew it. Start with Babylon. The skyline was pierced by the Etemenanke ziggurat, a multi-tiered mountain of baked brick dedicated to the god Marduk. This wasn't a modest shrine, it was an architectural flex measuring around 91 meters high. According to ancient sources, it was meant to bridge heaven and earth. And this wasn't just spiritual symbolism, it was centralized urban messaging. Roads led directly to the temple. Ceremonies revolved around it. The entire city bowed, architecturally and ritually, to its divine core. Teotihuacan too placed its spiritual heart front and center. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon weren't just ceremonial structures, they were urban anchors. The Avenue of the Dead connected these temples like a celestial path, aligned with astronomical events and possibly even solstices. Everything from residential compounds to market spaces radiated outward from these temples. They weren't mere background props. They were cosmic coordinates, guiding foot traffic and philosophy alike. And then there's Mohenjo-daro, which didn't have towering ziggurats or pyramids but instead gave us the Great Bath, a large public water tank likely used for ritual purification. This wasn't just a swimming hole. It was engineered with watertight bricks, a sophisticated drainage system, and possibly linked to spiritual practices of cleanliness and rebirth. No idols lined the sanctuaries here, just water, geometry, and silence. In all these cities, sacred spaces were deliberately placed and functionally integrated. Temples weren't isolated, they connected to processional roads, public courtyards, and administrative centers. Worship wasn't separate from life, it was life. Urban planning reflected this unity. These were not secular societies with temples. They were sacred landscapes disguised as cities. Every brick laid, every street carved, every plaza placed was part of a larger spiritual choreography. Because in the ancient world, to build a city was to make an offering, and the gods always got the best seat in the house. Underscore 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 underscore. It's tempting to think of modern cities as products of innovation, blueprints, and civil engineering degrees. But dig a little deeper, literally, and you'll find the bones of urban life were laid thousands of years ago by planners without concrete, bulldozers, or CAD software. The DNA of city planning, grids, zoning, sanitation, civic centers, religious spaces, was already etched into the earth by people we often underestimate. Take drainage. Mohenjo-daro didn't just throw down a few ditches. They designed an integrated, multi-level wastewater system that ran through homes and beneath streets. The concept of universal access to sanitation, still elusive in parts of the modern world, was a standard in this Bronze Age metropolis. Babylon laid the groundwork for regulated commerce, civic infrastructure, and the symbolic use of space to reinforce power and religion. Teotihuacan gave us the template of the cosmic city, one where every road, plaza, and temple pointed to something bigger than the human eye could see. Its builders connected astronomy to architecture, embedding celestial rhythms into everyday movement. These weren't just settlements. They were philosophical blueprints. Underscore 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 underscore. And then there's the psychological aspect. Ancient cities influenced behavior. Wide avenues allowed for processions and parades. Enclosed courtyards created communal spaces. Zoning wasn't just practical, it shaped how people interacted, how neighborhoods formed, and how authority was visualized. These choices told people where to gather, what was sacred, and how to live in harmony, or at least try. Modern urban planning owes much to this ancient foresight. Grids in Manhattan, sanitation in Amsterdam, temples turned into cathedrals turned into town halls. Even the idea of a civic center comes from these ancestral cityscapes. We still measure property. We still design cities around access, trade, spirituality, and spectacle. What's changed is the technology, not the principle. And while we pave highways and erect skyscrapers, the core remains. Cities are stories we write in stone, brick, and steel. And the first chapters of that story? They were carved with copper tools, etched in dust, and laid down with a reverence that still echoes today. Planned with star charts, and sustained by people who believed that good living required good planning. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember you're not just moving through space. You're walking through 4,000 years of ideas, quietly whispering beneath your feet. Underscore 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 underscore. Hadrian was not born in the heart of Rome, but on its distant western fringe. He came into the world in 76 CE in Italica, a Romanized town in the province of Hispania Baetica, modern-day southern Spain. Though geographically far from the capital, Hadrian's family was anything but provincial. They were wealthy, elite, and thoroughly Roman in culture and ambition. Most importantly, his father's side was related by blood to Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, the man who would later become Emperor Trajan. Hadrian lost both of his parents around age 10, a formative tragedy that thrust him into the guardianship of Trajan and Publius Acilius Attianus, a Roman knight. These two men would shape the trajectory of his life. While many young nobles were steered toward military or political careers, Hadrian gravitated toward Greek literature, philosophy, and the arts.